So here's the thing about that job. It wasn't the work. Not exactly. It was the speed. Everything happened so fast. One minute I was staring at a foreclosure notice. The next I was signing papers, getting a security clearance, and being handed a set of keys to a building that felt distant, like it wasn't really part of the town, just near it. I needed the insurance mostly. Sarah's treatments were costing everything we had, and even with the assistance programs, we were sinking. It wasn't glamorous, monitoring a dam all night, but it was steady, and it meant I could be home during the day with Sarah, which was the only thing that mattered. The operations center itself was built into the base of the dam, concrete and steel mostly. Damp, even though it was August, the air smelled like filtered water and old dust, with a faint undertone of something metallic, though not like blood, more like old pipes. The main room was dominated by a bank of monitors showing water levels, turbine speeds, all sorts of data I didn't understand yet. There were a couple of control panels with blinking lights and heavy-duty switches. It was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the generators was constant, a low thrum that vibrated in your chest, but apart from that, nothing. The previous operator, a guy named Miller, didn't say much. Just handed me the keys, a laminated ID badge, and a manila folder. "Here's the rundown," he said, already halfway out the door. "Standard procedures mostly, and these?" He tapped the folder. "Read them? They're pretty specific. Oh, and the coffee machine's temperamental. Good luck." And then he was gone, leaving me standing there with the keys and the folder, feeling like I'd been dropped into a movie halfway through. I went to the break room, made a cup of that temperamental coffee. It tasted like burnt pennies, but I drank it anyway and opened the folder. Inside were a few pages of standard operating procedures, then a separate sheet typed on what looked like ancient carbon paper. Important notes regarding night shift operations, it read. Below that, a list. The first one was, do not use the service entrance alone. If no one is available to accompany you, use the main entrance regardless of inconvenience. I frowned. The service entrance was right next to the parking lot. The main entrance was a 5-minute walk around the building. Inconvenience was an understatement. Probably just a security thing, I figured. They didn't want someone getting ambushed in the dark. The next one was stranger. Do not say goodbye, see you later, or any farewell when leaving the premises. The departure phrase is shifting tides. Use only that. Shifting tides? That was odd. I chuckled. Some old-timer's quirk, probably a superstition. Then came, if you find handwritten notes anywhere on the premises that are not part of the official log, do not read them. Place them in the sealed collection envelope at the front desk. Okay, that felt a little less like quirk and a little more like covering their bases. People leaving weird messages, maybe. Do not bring photographs of family, friends, or any person you recognize into the premises. Photographs of landscapes or objects are acceptable. That one made me pause. I had a picture of Sarah and our daughter, Lily, in my wallet. I always carried it. A little piece of home. I told myself it was just a liability thing. What if something happened and they found a picture of your loved ones? It could be distracting. At 11 p.m., check the roof access door. If it is unlocked, lock it. Do not look up before securing it. Do not check what may be on the roof. I blinked. That was specific. Like someone had actually had a problem with the roof door. Probably just vandalism, I thought. Kids messing around. All window shades in the control room must be drawn before 8 p.m. If you arrive after that time and any are open, close them. Do not look outside before closing them. This one really felt like someone was actively trying to keep you from seeing something, but what? I dismissed it. Probably glare on the monitors or something. If a visitor or resident tells you something about the building, its history, what happened here, what to watch out for, listen without confirming. Do not add to the account. Now that was just plain weird. Who is going to visit a dam operations center at night? And what kind of things would they say? And finally, do not wear any fragrance, perfume, cologne, scented lotion on the premises. Wear only unscented products. I didn't even wear cologne. It was a strange rule. I read through them again, shaking my head. Eccentric, that's what it was. A bunch of eccentric rules from some previous operator who'd gotten a little too attached to the place. I tossed the sheet onto the desk, finished my coffee, and started going through the checklists. It was 7:50 p.m. The window shades were already down. I glanced at the clock, then at the window, and a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't cold in the room, but I felt exposed. I cleared my throat and started logging the initial readings. The night had just begun. I was calibrating the turbidity sensors, which meant walking the length of the control room and checking the readings against the historical data. It was tedious, honestly, just numbers scrolling across a screen, confirming everything was within acceptable parameters. The water level was stable. Flow rates were consistent, all good. Sarah hated when I complained about work, even now. She said I should be grateful to have something, anything, with everything going on. She was right, of course. The sensors were old, though. Analog gauges were alongside the digital readouts. They hadn't bothered to fully upgrade everything, which felt typical. Cost-cutting measures. It wasn't like the dam was going anywhere. I ran my hand along the cool metal casing of the first sensor, making a note of the serial number in my little book. I was trying to work out the chords for a song I had stuck in my head, something slow and melancholic, fitting for the gray drizzle I'd seen on the drive-in. The melody felt right, but the lyrics were still just fragments. By the time I reached the last sensor, it was 8:17 p.m. I needed to grab the sample vials from the storage room before making my rounds of the perimeter cameras. The storage room was on the other side of the building, and the quickest way to get there was through the service entrance. It was a heavy steel door, used mostly for deliveries and maintenance. The main entrance was a longer walk, all the way around the front of the building, but it was better lit and, well, more public. That rule flickered in my mind. Something about not using the service entrance alone. I couldn't quite recall the exact wording. Something about a lack of witnesses. I dismissed it. It was probably just a safety thing, a precaution against someone getting accosted while carrying equipment. I hadn't seen another soul since old man Hemmings had given me the handover. He was probably long gone by now, home in bed. Still, the service entrance was so much closer. 2, maybe 3 minutes saved. I checked my watch again. Sarah's appointment was early tomorrow. Every minute I could shave off this shift was a minute I could spend with her before she went in. I started walking towards the service entrance, then stopped. It felt wrong. Not scary, exactly, just off. Like I was deliberately ignoring something I shouldn't. I pictured Hemmings shuffling through paperwork, muttering about protocols. He hadn't exactly been enthusiastic about explaining anything, just pointed at the rulebook and said, "Read it, it's all in there." I remembered the feeling of being overwhelmed by the sheer number of them, all these specific little instructions, like the building itself was trying to tell you something. No, it was just a job. A weird job, sure, but a job nonetheless. I turned around and started walking towards the main entrance. I grumbled under my breath about wasted time and unnecessary rules. It was ridiculous, really. All this paranoia over a few minutes. I arrived at the main entrance at 8:20 p.m., 2 minutes later than I would have been. The security desk was empty, the chair swiveling slowly. I swiped my card, the door clicked open, and I stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and stale coffee. I walked towards the storage room, feeling a little foolish. I'd let a silly rule dictate my actions. It was probably nothing. But as I passed the large windows facing the parking lot, I glanced out, almost against my will. The lot was empty, as usual, but there was a single set of tire tracks in the wet asphalt, leading directly to the service entrance. Fresh tracks. And they hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. I shook my head, grabbed the vials, and started my camera rounds. I didn't mention the tracks in the log. I was running diagnostics on the emergency generator. It was tucked away in a small concrete building 50 yards from the main operations center, connected by a covered walkway. The generator hadn't been used in months, probably years, but it was part of my routine to check the fuel levels, the oil, the battery charge. Old man Hemmings had shown me the checklist, a faded photocopied sheet with handwritten notes, scribbled in the margins. He'd barely glanced at me while he explained it, more interested in adjusting his hearing aid. The building was cold and damp. The concrete walls seemed to absorb all the heat. I shivered, even with my jacket zipped up. The air smelled like stale diesel and dust. I opened the fuel tank hatch and stuck the dipstick in. Full, good. I jotted down the reading in my notebook, next to a half-finished chord progression I'd been working on. It was a minor key, naturally. Everything felt minor key these days. The generator was a big, hulking thing, covered in grease and grime. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I ran my hand along the side, feeling the rough texture of the metal. It was surprisingly cold, colder than the air inside the building. I checked the oil, then the battery. Everything was within acceptable limits. Another check mark on the list, another 5 minutes closer to getting back inside. I was finishing up, tightening a loose bolt on the control panel, when I heard someone approaching the walkway. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. It was probably just one of the day shift engineers coming to check on something. I didn't pay much attention. I finished tightening the bolt, capped the oil reservoir, and headed for the door. As I stepped out into the walkway, I saw Old Man Hemmings. He was walking towards me, carrying a thermos and a lunch bag. He looked tired, more tired than usual. He stopped a few feet away and gave me a small wave. "Everything all right with the generator?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Looks good," I said. "Fuel's full, oil's good, batteries charged, all systems nominal." He nodded slowly. "Good. Good." He paused, then added, "Well, I'm heading out. Have a good night." "You too," I said automatically. "See you tomorrow." He blinked, and something flickered in his eyes. Just for a second. It was so quick I almost missed it. Then he started walking again, shaking his head slightly. I couldn't quite place the expression. It was like disappointment, annoyance. Then it hit me, the rule. That sentence buried somewhere in the middle of the document, something about departures, about not using certain phrases. It wasn't "see you tomorrow," it was something else entirely. I racked my brain, trying to remember the exact wording. It felt like a phantom limb, just out of reach. Something about needing to use the specific phrase for a safe return. I dismissed it. Hemmings was an old man. He probably just said it out of habit. It wasn't worth getting hung up on. It was probably a completely irrational precaution. But a knot tightened in my stomach. I should have said it, whatever it was. I watched him walk away, feeling a growing sense of unease. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, disappearing around the corner of the main building. I checked my watch, 9:47 p.m. Sarah was scheduled for a scan at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I'd promised to be there, to hold her hand. I'd promised to drive her. I realized I hadn't called to check on her since I got to work. I always called after the generator check, just to hear her voice, just to make sure everything was okay. I reached for my phone, then stopped. I remembered the rule about personal calls, the one about disrupting the frequency. It wasn't a hard rule, but Hemmings had stressed the importance of minimizing any kind of interference. I hesitated for a moment, then put my phone back in my pocket. I'd call during my next break. It wasn't a big deal. It was only a few hours. But as I walked back towards the operations center, a cold dread began to creep into my bones. I had a sudden, irrational fear that something had happened, something that I should have known about, something that a simple phone call could have prevented. I quickened my pace, the image of Sarah's face, pale and drawn, flashing in my mind. I should have called. I should have said the right thing to Hemmings, and now all I could do was keep going and hope that everything was still all right. The air in the main control room was stale, smelling faintly of dust and old electronics. It wasn't a bad smell, exactly, just permanent. Like the smell of a basement you haven't cleaned in decades. I was running a diagnostic on the spillway sensors, scrolling through lines of numbers on the monitor, making sure everything was reading within acceptable parameters. It was tedious, but necessary. Old Man Hemmings had drilled into me the importance of preventative maintenance. An ounce of prevention, he'd said, is worth a pound of regret when you're staring down a wall of water. I'd been at it for about 20 minutes. The rhythmic clicking of the keyboard was the only sound besides the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Sarah would be waking up soon. I imagined her stretching, reaching for her water glass. I hoped the scan hadn't knocked her around too much. She was getting weaker, and even these routine checks exhausted her. That insurance was the only reason I was here. Without it, we'd already be. I pushed the thought away. No use dwelling on it. I stretched, my back popping with a satisfying crack. I needed coffee. Badly. I stood up and walked over to the small kitchenette tucked into the corner of the room. It was mostly just a hot plate, a microwave, and a sad little refrigerator stocked with vending machine leftovers. I grabbed a chipped mug from the cupboard and started to make a fresh pot. The machine gurgled and spat as it brewed. That's when I saw it. A folded piece of paper tucked under the keyboard of the auxiliary console. It was a pale yellow, like someone had printed on recycled stock. My name, scrawled in blocky, uneven handwriting, was visible even through the fold. Kieran. My first thought was Hemmings. He was a bit of a prankster, always leaving little notes around, but his handwriting was neat, precise. This was different, messy, almost frantic. I hesitated. I remembered something about notes, something in the folder, not official logs, handwritten notes found around the place. Something about not reading them, about a sealed envelope. It was probably just Hemmings testing me, seeing if I was paying attention. A way to make sure I'd read the manual. I unfolded it, my fingers brushing against the rough paper. Just as I started to read the first line, a high-pitched whine cut through the hum of the ventilation. It wasn't loud, but it was unsettling, like a dog whistle almost. I glanced around, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from the generator room. It stopped as suddenly as it started. I froze, the paper halfway unfolded in my hand. The whine had been just enough to break my concentration, to remind me of the rule. The envelope. The sealed envelope at the front desk. I quickly refolded the note, smoothing out the creases. It felt heavy in my hand. I didn't read a single word. I walked to the front desk, my steps feeling strangely deliberate. The security guard, a young kid named Davis, was slumped in his chair, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as I approached. "Hey," I said, dropping the folded note onto the desk. "Found this under the keyboard in the control room." Davis glanced at it briefly. "Okay, I'll put it in the envelope." He didn't ask what it was, didn't seem particularly interested. He just reached for the manila envelope hanging on a hook beside the phone and slipped the note inside. I watched him for a moment, a strange feeling settling over me. Relief mostly, but also something else. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like being watched. I went back to the control room and finished my coffee. It tasted bitter, metallic. Even with sugar, I couldn't get rid of the taste. As I stared at the spillway sensors, I noticed a small smudge of yellow ink on my fingertip. I rubbed it against my jeans, but it wouldn't come off. It faded to a pale stain, a faint echo of the note I hadn't read. I glanced at the front desk. Davis was gone. The envelope was still hanging there, empty, swaying slightly in the draft. I was running the diagnostics on the auxiliary pump system. It was a tedious process, cycling through each valve, monitoring pressure gauges, logging the readings in the digital log. The kind of thing that filled the dead hours between scheduled checks. The control room was quiet, just the low thrum of the building systems and the occasional hum from the ventilation. It was peaceful. I'd gotten into a rhythm, a sort of meditative state where I could almost ignore the ache in my lower back. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m., still a long stretch until sunrise, and even longer until I could get home to Sarah. The medical bills were piling up, and the thought of them was a constant weight in my chest. The insurance covered most of the treatment, thankfully, but there were always copays, deductibles, unexpected expenses. I needed to focus, needed to get through this shift, needed to keep the dam running smoothly. A failure here wouldn't just be a job loss, it could have real consequences for the town. I finished the first pump cycle and reached for my phone to check the time again, mostly a way to avoid looking at the digital clock. The screen lit up, and my stomach did a little flip. There it was, staring back at me. A picture of Sarah, laughing, taken last summer at the lake. It was a good picture. She looked genuinely happy, and for a moment, just looking at it, I felt a little bit of that happiness too. Then it hit me. The rule, something about photographs, not landscapes, not buildings, but people, specifically people you knew. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the feeling was there, a cold, insistent dread. It had been in the initial document, the one I'd skimmed through during training. Something about creating a connection about the site, knowing who they were. It was ridiculous, of course. A silly superstition. Just another one of those bizarre protocols designed to keep us on our toes, a way to test our attention to detail. I'd probably misinterpreted it. It likely meant no personal photos displayed in the control room, which made sense from a security standpoint, a reasonable precaution. I'd just keep my phone face down for the rest of the shift. Problem solved. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't a logical fear. It was a physical reaction. A sudden dryness in my mouth, a tightness in my chest. My skin felt too sensitive, as if every pore was open and exposed. I unlocked my phone and went into the settings. It took maybe 30 seconds to change the wallpaper to a simple dark gray gradient. It felt wrong, like I was erasing a part of myself, like I was actively trying to forget her. I glanced up at the security monitors. Everything looked normal. The perimeter fences, the spillway, the generator room. Nothing out of the ordinary. I returned to the pump diagnostics, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the same as before. After the note, this was different, more focused, more deliberate. As I was checking the pressure readings on pump 3, I noticed a flicker on monitor 4, the view of the service entrance. It was brief, barely perceptible. Just a momentary distortion in the image, like a heat shimmer. I initially dismissed it as a glitch in the camera. These things happened all the time with the aging equipment. But then it happened again and again. Each time, the distortion seemed to coalesce into a shape. Not a clear shape, not something I could define, more like a negative space, a void within the image. It wasn't a person, not a shadow, and definitely not an animal. It was a displacement. Like the image itself was struggling to render something that wasn't supposed to be there. I zoomed in on the monitor, trying to get a clearer view. The distortion intensified, swirling and shifting, as if something was pressing against the lens. It began to resemble peripherally a silhouette that was familiar, the way the shoulders sloped, the curve of the head. It mirrored, in its distortion, the way Sarah stood when she was concentrating. I quickly switched to another camera, then another. The main gate, the spillway, the generator room. Everything was normal. I switched back to monitor 4. The distortion was gone. The image was clear, sharp, unremarkable. The service entrance was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the security lights. I sat back in my chair, my throat aching. The gray wallpaper on my phone felt cold against my fingertips. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, fatigue. But the image of that distorted silhouette, the unsettling familiarity of its shape, lingered in my mind. It wasn't about the camera, it wasn't about the rule, or the note, or anything logical. I ran a full diagnostic on monitor 4. The camera was functioning perfectly. No errors, no glitches, no indication of a technical problem. I checked the recording logs, there was nothing. No evidence of the distortion, no anomaly in the data stream. It was as if it hadn't happened. I looked at the clock. 3:02 a.m. I had 4 more hours to go. I reached for my notebook, intending to jot down a few chords to try and distract myself. But my hand wouldn't move. Instead, I stared at the blank page, the gray wallpaper pressing against my vision. I knew with a chilling certainty that something had shifted, something had changed, and it wasn't the camera, it was me. Or rather, what I'd done. I'd followed the rule, I'd changed the wallpaper, and it hadn't stopped anything, it had only acknowledged it. I was recalibrating the flow sensors on the north spillway gate. It was tedious work, mostly tightening fittings and running diagnostic checks on the pressure regulators. The metal was cold under my fingertips, even through the gloves. The air in the spillway chamber always felt damp, like the inside of a well. I'd been at it for an hour, methodically working my way along the length of the gate, and hadn't encountered anything unexpected, just the usual groaning of the hydraulic cylinders and the low thrum of the generators. I kept glancing at the clock. 2:15 a.m. Sarah's appointment was tomorrow, a checkup to see if the latest round of chemo was doing anything. It felt pointless, honestly. She was thinner, weaker, and the pain was getting harder to manage. The insurance covered most of it, thankfully, but the copays and the medication were still draining us. This job, it was a lifeline, even if it was a strange one, even if it meant spending my nights surrounded by concrete and water. I finished the last sensor check, and was about to log the data when I remembered the maintenance schedule. The roof access door. It was listed under routine security checks alongside things like perimeter fence inspections and emergency light testing. I'd skimmed the schedule when I started, but hadn't really paid attention to the specifics. It was 2 a.m. I checked my watch again, right on time. I walked down the narrow corridor towards the stairwell. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of ozone and dust. I thought about the photograph, the one I'd pulled out of my wallet earlier, just to look at her. I hadn't meant to, not really. It was just a moment of weakness. I'd put it back, of course, shoved it deep into my back pocket, but the image was still vivid in my mind. Her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. I felt a tightness in my chest, a familiar ache of worry, and now this, the monitor thing. I tried to dismiss it. A trick of the light, fatigue, stress. It had to be. I was letting things get to me. The stairwell was cold and metallic. Each step echoed in the confined space. At the top, a heavy steel door led to the roof access. I unlocked it with my keycard, the mechanism clicking with a solid, reassuring sound. It felt heavier than I remembered, needing a firm push to swing open, and that's when I noticed it. The air coming from the roof wasn't just cold. It was still. Completely still, no breeze, no sound, nothing. It was unsettling, and I immediately regretted thinking about the photo, about the monitor. It was all connected somehow, I was sure of it. I was being irrational, letting paranoia creep in. It was a metal door on a concrete roof. It shouldn't feel like holding my breath. I told myself it was just the pressure change, the difference in temperature. I reached for the locking mechanism, intending to secure the door and get back downstairs. But as my hand touched the steel handle, I felt a subtle shift. A weight pressing against the door from the other side. Not a forceful push, not a visible movement, but a definite presence. It felt like something had adjusted its position, settled into a more attentive posture. Without thinking, without pausing to analyze or rationalize, I threw the bolt. The heavy latch clicked into place with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence. I didn't look up. I didn't even glance at the roof. I simply turned and walked back down the stairs, my boots clanging against the metal treads. Back in the control room, I sat down at my console, my hands clammy. I ran another diagnostic on monitor 4, just to confirm it hadn't been acting up. It showed a clear, undisturbed image of the service entrance. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. The air felt different now, thicker, and the silence. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something listening. I checked the time. 2:22 a.m. I had 2 hours and 38 minutes left. I opened my notebook, intending to write something, anything, to distract myself, but the page remained blank. I stared at the gray wallpaper on my phone, a familiar pattern I'd barely noticed before. It seemed distorted now, like the shapes were shifting, subtly rearranging themselves, like the image itself was trying to tell me something. It wasn't the wallpaper. I knew that. It was me, or rather, it was whatever I'd locked on the roof, and I hadn't looked. I hadn't allowed myself to see what was waiting. I didn't know what I'd prevented. I only knew that I hadn't seen it. And that felt like the most terrifying thing of all. I was calibrating the flow meters on the east side of the control room. It was tedious work, checking the readings against the historical data, making minute adjustments to the digital controls. It was the kind of task they gave to the overnight operator, the stuff that didn't require a lot of thought, didn't need a qualified engineer, just someone to make sure the numbers looked right. And honestly, it was a welcome distraction. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to Sarah, to the hospital bills, to the foreclosure notice taped to the fridge. The room was warm, a constant 72 degrees, maintained by the building's HVAC system. It smelled faintly of machine oil and stale coffee, a smell I was starting to associate with, well, with everything. Now, with loneliness, with worry, with the quiet hum of the dam, holding back 1,000,000 gallons of water. I'd been fiddling with the same meter for almost 20 minutes, trying to get it to align with the previous day's readings. It was off by a fraction of a percent, barely noticeable, but enough to flag in the system. I kept telling myself it wasn't important, that these fluctuations were normal, that I was overthinking things. Just a job, I kept saying to myself. Just a job to pay the bills. I glanced at the clock, 8:17 p.m. I hadn't even noticed the time passing. Usually, I made a point of checking it every 15 minutes, just to keep track of the shift. But I'd been lost in the numbers, in the repetitive motion of adjusting the controls. I remembered the schedule, the window shades, something about them needing to be down before 8. It had been mentioned in the orientation, a quick line in a long list of procedures. I'd mostly tuned it out, figuring it was just some aesthetic thing, some preference of the day shift supervisor. I looked up, towards the bank of windows that ran along the south wall of the control room. 3 of them were open, revealing the parking lot and the surrounding landscape. It wasn't terribly scenic, just a gravel lot, some scrub trees, and the dark bulk of the dam itself. But the windows were supposed to be closed. I thought about Hemmings, the guy I'd relieved earlier. He hadn't mentioned anything about the shades. He hadn't mentioned a lot of things now that I thought about it. He'd been unusually quiet, almost distracted. It probably meant nothing. Hemmings was new, still learning the ropes. Maybe he'd simply forgotten, or maybe he'd just been in a hurry to get home. It was a silly rule, really. Window shades. What difference did it make if they were open or closed? I could just ignore it. It wasn't like anyone was going to come down here and check, but the image of the roof door, the feeling of something shifting behind it, kept replaying in my mind. I'd followed the rule then, hadn't I? Secured the door without looking. Maybe it was better to just stick to the procedures to avoid any unnecessary complications. I stood up and walked over to the first window. The shade was a heavy, dark blue vinyl attached to a roller mechanism. I reached for the cord, hesitated for a split second, and then pulled it down. The shade descended with a smooth, mechanical whir, blocking out the view. I moved to the second window, repeating the process, and then the third. As I was lowering the last shade, I caught a glimpse of the parking lot, a quick, fleeting impression before the darkness descended. There was a car there that I didn't recognize, a dark sedan parked near the far end, partially obscured by the trees. I was almost certain it hadn't been there when I last looked, maybe an hour ago. I couldn't be sure. The light was bad, and my memory wasn't exactly reliable these days. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the cord, staring at the blank vinyl. It was probably just a visitor, a late arrival, someone who'd come to check on the dam or maybe one of the engineers, but something felt off. The car didn't seem to belong. It was just a feeling, a vague sense of unease. I tried to rationalize it. I was tired, stressed, and my imagination was running wild. It was the job, the isolation, the constant pressure. It was all getting to me. But the image of that car, the certainty that it hadn't been there before, lingered in my mind. I finished my rounds, double-checking all the meters, logging the data. The flow rate on turbine 3 was slightly higher than usual, but within acceptable limits. The water level in the reservoir was stable. Everything seemed normal, except for that car, and the feeling that I'd just done the wrong thing, even though I'd followed the rules. I sat back down at my console and opened my notebook. I tried to write a song, to capture the mood, to find some kind of outlet for the anxiety that was building inside me. But the words wouldn't come. The page remained blank. I closed the notebook and stared at the clock. 8:43 p.m. I had another hour and 17 minutes left. And now I had a car to worry about, and a nagging feeling that I'd seen something I shouldn't have even without looking, even through a gap in the shade. I was recalibrating the pressure sensors on the north spillway gate. It was a tedious job, involving a handheld diagnostic tool and a lot of crouching in a damp concrete alcove. The air down there was colder, heavier, smelling of mildew and something metallic like old pipes. My knees were starting to ache, and I knew I'd be feeling it tomorrow. I kept thinking about Sarah, about whether she'd managed to get a decent meal, about the doctor's appointment next week. The insurance covered everything, thankfully, but it didn't cover the worry. The sensors themselves were unremarkable. Small metal cylinders embedded in the concrete. They registered the water pressure against the gate, sending data back to the control panel. The readings had been fluctuating slightly, just enough to trigger a warning light. It was probably nothing, just a temporary anomaly. But here, everything felt like a potential anomaly. Everything felt like it needed constant monitoring, constant adjustment. It was exhausting. I tightened a connection on one of the sensors, and the reading stabilized. Good. One less thing to worry about. I was about to move on to the next sensor when I heard footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the concrete tunnel. I figured it was Old Man Hemlock, the night security guard. He did his rounds every couple of hours, a silent, shadowy figure who barely acknowledged my presence. I didn't mind. I preferred the silence. I braced myself, shifting my weight so I wouldn't have to get up completely when he passed. He didn't pass, he stopped, right at the entrance to the alcove. "Interesting place, this?" he said, his voice raspy and low. "Been here a long while, you know, longer than most folks realize." I didn't respond, just continued fiddling with the diagnostic tool, pretending to be absorbed in the readings. He hadn't asked a question, hadn't even looked at me directly. He was talking about the dam, not to me. "They built it after the flood of 1937, he continued, leaning closer, the beam of his flashlight briefly illuminating the damp concrete walls. "Wiped out the whole town downstream. Said it wouldn't happen again. They had to move a lot of graves, you know, re-enter them up on the hill. Didn't treat them right, some say." He paused, and I could smell the faint scent of pipe tobacco. Old Man Tiberius, he was the foreman during the construction. He knew where everything was, every stone, every body. Said the dam was built on a sensitive spot, a place where things weren't meant to be disturbed. My jaw tightened. I wanted to ask him what he meant by sensitive spot. I wanted to ask him about the graves, about Old Man Tiberius. I needed to know if there were records, if the stories were true. My fingers tightened around the diagnostic tool. I could ask. It would be a normal, harmless question, but something, a cold knot in my stomach, told me not to. Something about the way he was talking, the way he wasn't looking at me, the way the air felt thick and still. It reminded me of that feeling I had with the shades, like there was a right way and a very wrong way to respond. I stayed silent, focusing intently on the sensor readings. I could feel his gaze on me, weighing me down. It wasn't hostile, not exactly. More observant. Like he was waiting for a reaction. I concentrated on the numbers, forcing myself to ignore the unsettling stories, to dismiss the old man's rambling as the product of a lonely night and too much tobacco. He was just an old man, spinning yarns. It had to be. He spoke again, his voice even softer now. He said, "If you listen close enough, you can still hear them, the ones who were moved, especially when the water's high." I kept my eyes fixed on the sensor. I didn't nod, didn't shake my head, didn't make a sound, just continued to adjust the calibration. After what felt like an eternity, he cleared his throat. "Well," he said finally, and the sound startled me. "Just thought I'd share. Carry on then." He turned and walked away, his footsteps receding into the tunnel. The beam of his flashlight disappeared around a bend. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the silence, my heart doing a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. It wasn't hammering, not exactly. More like a dull ache, a pressure building in my chest. I finished calibrating the sensors faster now, almost frantic. I needed to get back to the control room, to the familiar glow of the monitors, to the reassuring hum of the machines. As I was packing up the diagnostic tool, I noticed something. The access panel to the spillway control mechanism, the one I'd had to open to reach the sensors, wasn't fully closed. It hadn't been before Hemlock arrived. I distinctly remembered leaving it slightly ajar to allow for ventilation. Now it was almost flush, latched, secured. I hadn't touched it, and I hadn't heard it click shut. I stared at the panel, a cold wave washing over me. I needed to check it, to make sure everything was functioning correctly. A faulty seal could compromise the entire system, but the rule, that awful, unspoken rule about not adding to the story, held me back. To open the panel, to investigate, would be to acknowledge his account, to validate his words. It would be to participate. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. My gut screamed at me to check it, to ensure the safety of the dam, of the town downstream. But I didn't. I couldn't. I packed up my tools and left the alcove, leaving the panel secured, leaving the mechanism unchecked. I walked back to the control room, the weight of that undone task pressing down on me, heavier than the damp air, heavier than the worry about Sarah. I was logging flow rates into the digital ledger, a tedious process, but necessary. Each turbine had its own panel, a cascade of numbers updating in real time. I liked this part of the shift, the predictable rhythm of it. It gave me something to focus on, something to keep the edges of my mind from fraying. Sarah hadn't been sleeping well, and the worry had settled in my bones like a persistent ache. The bills were piling up, the bank was calling more frequently, and the construction foreman hadn't returned my calls in weeks. This job was a lifeline, even if it was a strange one. The screens cast a pale blue light across the room, reflecting in the polished metal of the control panels. It was quiet, just the low hum of the generators and the occasional click of the keyboard. I double-checked the readings for Turbine 3, making a small note in my little songbook. A chord progression had been stuck in my head all day, a minor key melody that felt fitting somehow. I scribbled down a few lyrics, something about rushing water and shadows. It wasn't good, but it was a distraction. I reached for my coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to ward off the chill that seemed to permeate the concrete walls. I'd forgotten to bring a sweater. Stupid. I always forgot something. I reached into my pocket for lip balm, the skin around my mouth already cracking from the dry air. That's when I smelled it. It was faint at first, a subtle sweetness, vanilla maybe, with a hint of something floral. I hadn't put on cologne in years. Sarah hated the smell, and I hadn't used any hand lotion since I'd started this job. The rule. Something about scents, about not leaving a trail. It flickered at the edge of my memory, a half-remembered warning. Something about things following. I dismissed it almost immediately. It must be residue from the day shift. Maybe Hemmings used something. He always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and something else I couldn't place. I was about to return to the ledger when I remembered I needed to check the auxiliary cooling pumps. They were located in a small equipment room down the hall, a cramped space filled with pipes and machinery. I stood up, stretching my back, and started walking. As I moved, the scent seemed to grow stronger, clinging to the air around me. It wasn't Hemmings tobacco. This was distinctly different. I passed the security monitor displaying the camera feed from the generator hall. A quick glance showed nothing unusual. Just the rows of turbines, the concrete floor, the flickering lights. But as I walked past, I noticed a momentary distortion on the screen, a ripple effect that seemed to bend the image. It was gone in a split second, but it was there, like looking at something through heat haze. I told myself it was a glitch, a faulty connection. The equipment in this place was ancient. The equipment room was colder than the control room, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. I flipped on the light, the fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead. I located the cooling pumps, their gauges reading within normal parameters. Good. I started to turn back towards the door when I noticed it again. The scent. It was stronger now, almost overpowering, and it seemed to be moving. I stopped, my hand resting on the metal doorframe. I could smell it just behind me, a faint, sweet trail. It wasn't coming from the pumps or from the pipes. It was following me. I slowly turned my head, glancing over my shoulder. The room was empty. Just the pumps, the pipes, the shadows. But the scent remained lingering in the air. I took a step back, then another. Each movement seemed to amplify the fragrance, to draw it closer. Logic told me it was my imagination, a trick of the air conditioning, a lingering smell from somewhere else. But the feeling of being watched, of being pursued, was undeniable. I hadn't worn any scented product, absolutely none. I double-checked my pockets as if maybe a stray sample had somehow gotten in there. Nothing. I backed out of the equipment room, slowly, carefully. The scent followed me, a silent, invisible presence. I walked back towards the control room, my pace quickening with each step. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see something, anything, but the hallway remained empty. The control room felt like a sanctuary, a haven of sterile air and blinking lights. I sat back down at the console, my hands trembling slightly. It was just a smell, a coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I had done something to attract attention. I glanced down at my hands. I remembered applying a small amount of hand cream before leaving the house that morning. A new brand Sarah had bought me, something with shea butter and vanilla extract. I hadn't even thought about it. I'd been rushing, trying to get out the door quickly to be home for Sarah's appointment. I'd completely forgotten the rule, the scent rule. I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea washing over me. I'd left a trail, a map, and something, whatever it was following it. I started logging the flow rates again. My movements mechanical, my mind racing. I had to focus. I had to appear normal. I couldn't let anyone know what had happened, especially not Hemmings. I checked the security monitor again. Still nothing. But this time, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was no longer alone. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and the scent, though faint, was still there. Lingering, waiting. I kept checking the monitors, glancing at the hallway, listening for any sound. The shift stretched out before me, an endless expanse of darkness and dread. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I would be watched for the rest of the night. The morning light through the windshield was blinding. I hadn't driven in daylight for, I couldn't even remember. Weeks, maybe. Everything had been shades of gray, and the harsh glare of the control room monitors. I pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Sarah's car was already gone. Her appointments always started early. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled like nothing. That was the first thing I noticed. Not Sarah's potpourri, not the faint scent of lemon cleaner she used on the weekends. Just emptiness. It felt wrong. I shook it off. Probably just hadn't aired it out in a while. I'd open some windows later. I moved through the living room, avoiding eye contact with the framed photos on the mantelpiece. I hadn't looked at them since everything. I'd packed them away, really, just hadn't gotten around to putting them back. I found a note on the kitchen counter. Dr. Alvarez wants to adjust the dosage. See you around 4. Relief washed over me. At least I wouldn't miss her. I started making coffee, automatically checking the back door lock 3 times as I did. It wasn't a conscious decision, just something I did now, a reflex. I didn't recall ever being particularly diligent about locking doors before. The coffee tasted metallic, or maybe it was just my imagination. I poured a second cup anyway. I'd been trying to get back into songwriting, but the melodies felt flat, the lyrics forced. It was like something had muted the colors inside my head. I picked up my notebook, flipped to a blank page. My hand hovered over the paper, then dropped back to my side. I couldn't. Not yet. I spent the afternoon cleaning, obsessively. Every surface scrubbed, every corner dusted. I even reorganized the pantry, alphabetizing the canned goods. It was a distraction, a way to fill the hours until Sarah got home. But even as I worked, I kept glancing at the windows, checking the shadows, listening for sounds. It was exhausting. I tried to convince myself it was just residual stress from the job, from the worry about Sarah, that I was hypervigilant because I'd been forced to be, that it would pass, but I knew it wasn't true. Sarah came home around 4:30, looking tired but hopeful. She told me about the appointment, about the new medication. She seemed brighter. We ate dinner in silence, mostly. It wasn't an awkward silence, just a comfortable one. We'd gotten used to quiet. After dinner, she went to lie down. I stayed at the kitchen table, staring at my notebook. I picked up a pen, finally. But instead of writing lyrics, I started drawing. Not consciously. My hand just moved, sketching the layout of the dam, the control room, the generator hall, the equipment room, the service entrance. I drew the shadows, the angles, the placement of the security cameras. I drew it over and over, each iteration more detailed than the last. I didn't understand why, it just felt necessary. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something on the bathroom counter. A small glass bottle. It wasn't Sarah's. She used lotion with a lavender scent. This one was clear, unlabeled, and it smelled faintly of vanilla. I stared at it for a long time, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I didn't remember buying it. I didn't recognize it at all. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, then carefully placed it on the top shelf of the linen closet, as far away from everything else as possible. I didn't throw it away. I couldn't explain why. I just put it up there.